Hi everybody and welcome to the webinar. We've just got a couple of minutes, so just make sure everybody who is going to join us today. See lots of people chatting, that's good stuff. Do let me know if you can't hear the audio at the moment. It should be working my end, but you know, technology. Okay, perfect. It looks like everybody can hear me. Okay, so hi, welcome to the webinar. Thank you so much for coming. We've got lots of really great tips and information today to get through, and I'm excited to share all about accessible design with you. So today we're going to be talking about accessible design, and we're going to cover off the different accessibility needs, and I'm going to provide loads of actionable advice and tips for making your internal and external comms better for people who live with autism, colour blindness, visual impairments, dyslexia, and more. So the first thing I really want to know is, what are some of the roadblocks that you currently face in your communications? If there's anything in particular that you really found as a roadblock that you really want to kind of learn how to tackle today, I'd love to know that. Make sure that we're giving you the best advice possible. Quite often when we talk about accessibility roadblocks, we're talking about things like not enough time, not enough funding. It's not really seen as a priority in the organisation. People don't really know how to deal with it. They don't know what they should be looking out for. Funds for dyslexia, yep, we're definitely going to get that covered as well. It's really interesting when we talk about accessibility because there are so many different things that we can do to make things more accessible. And, it's quite a beefy topic, so I'm hoping, we can get through quite a lot of actionable tips today. And yes, the webinar will be recorded and you will be able to watch this back later. So if you want to share this with anybody afterwards as well, you'll have the recording and you can do that. Difficult to build content and narrow down percentage of users who need it. Yeah, that's another thing, especially when you work in a small organization, proving that there is a value in the accessibility can be really difficult. Okay, cool. So it seems like we've got lots of people who have actual problems at the moment that we're going to help you tackle. And let's dive right in. So the main things that you're going to take away from this webinar are what are the different types of accessibility and their communication needs, how to create accessible internal digital comms, and how to create accessible marketing materials. I've put a bunch of these accessibility tips into practice during this webinar too, so you should get a good idea of what accessible design looks like in action. So hopefully you'll start to spot those as we go along. So a quick overview of the agenda. Intro and housekeeping, that's where we are now. And then I'll talk through what we actually mean by accessible design. Then we'll cover off some accessibility needs, and I'll give you some proof points of why accessible design is important. So, if you're looking for reasons why you should put accessible design into practice, this is going to be a good section for you. And then we'll run through an overview of accessible design in the form of an accessibility checklist. After that, I'll talk about accessible internal comms, such as newsletters, reports, presentations, and process documents. And then accessible external comms, like social media images, print materials. And then we'll have a bit of a time at the end for a Q&A. So if there's any questions that I haven't answered, absolutely excited to go through those. And a quick bit of housekeeping. So if you have any questions, pop them in the chat as we go along, and I'll try and answer them all at the end. We're going to email out the slides and the recording in case you want to watch back or note down any tips or even share with somebody else. And look up for your accessible design checklist as well, which is a PDF checklist that you can download and just keep for whenever you're creating materials. So as an introduction to me, hi, I'm Alice. I'm a content marketer at Bengage. I write and make videos about communication, about design, about how to really make your point understood through visual communication. But I haven't always been a content marketer. Previously, I was an educator, and I taught non-neurotypical kids key literacy and communication skills through filmmaking. And in that role, I learned so much about the unspoken communications that go on, and how for some people it can be difficult to fully process or understand. I've been passionate about accessibility for such a long time, and coming from a background where I had first-hand experience with different communication styles, I was thrilled when Engage wanted me to write this webinar. I hope you can all learn some new tips about accessibility, and I'm really excited to hear about your experiences too. Now, before we get into how to make your designs accessible, let's talk about why you should. Did you know that 1 in every 4 Americans live with a disability? It's thought that up to 15% of Americans have dyslexia, and a further 10% live with color blindness. That's a huge amount of people that you're potentially excluding from your designs and communication materials without even realizing. Accessible design is designs that are stood by everybody. We talk about accessibility a lot in terms of the physical accessibility of a space or a business, but your internal and external comms should be easily understood by the most people possible. So, simply put, accessible design is a type of design that has taken into consideration how people are able to understand the information being presented. So what are some different accessibility needs when we're talking about accessible design? So a couple of the key ones that I'm going to cover off are color blindness, dyslexia, visual impairments, neurodiversity, and autism. There will be more, and accessibility is a spectrum, so individual requirements will differ. If you're designing for accessibility for an individual in particular, it's always best to talk to that person and work out how you can help them best. One good analogy is to think of accessibility like a color wheel. Everyone lies on a different point in the color wheel and they're all a different color, but it's not a linear thing. There'll be some accessibility overlaps, but not everything will be applicable for everybody. This is probably why accessible design isn't as common as it should be, because it can be a hard thing to wrap your head around first of all, but it's also hard to identify universal adjustments that work for everyone on the spectrum. So what are the different types of accessibility we'll be talking about today? Color blindness is when a person has difficulties perceiving different types of color. Color blindness is commonly thought of as you can't see color at all and life's in black and white, but that's not actually the case. It's actually more to do with being unable to see one specific light range of color. Without getting too technical, we can only perceive color because our eyes process white light through 3 receptors, red, green, and blue. If one of those receptors doesn't work as expected, your understanding of color will be different. The one you've probably heard of is red-green color blindness, but there are other types too. People who live with color blindness have different accessibility needs, as the colors that we use to signify difference or contrast often don't register for them. For example, here's a sales chart, lovely and color coordinated about all of the sales that you've made this month. But here's how people with red-green color blindness would see it. You can just about make out the different segments, but it's really not clear at all. And why would you try and make it more difficult for people if you could just pick a different color palette entirely? When it comes to dyslexia, the accessibility is often in the text and the language used rather than the design choices themselves. But there are ways that we can help dyslexic people understand information via design. For some people with dyslexia, the words appear to jump about on the page or become all muddled up. This is just an example that I pulled from the internet. But there are ways in design that you can counteract that through using icons and spacing your text, and we'll cover these off as well. Visual impairments is another accessibility challenge that is unique to each person. Ranging from full blindness to blurred vision, light sensitivity, or night blindness, visual impairments is a catch-all term. The Braille Institute actually have this really cool app that lets you experience the internet through the eyes of people with visual impairments. This is an example that I've pulled how somebody with macular degeneration would see a web page. Some of the ways to design communications that are accessible to people with visual impairments are using clear, simple fonts and adding alt text, as well as making use of visuals and distinct segments or sections of your documents. Neurodiversity is a term that's been bubbling about for a while, but it's starting to be used a lot more. Over the past few years, the term neurotypical has been used to describe people who don't have autism, ADHD, or any other neurological processing problems. However, this framing is quite problematic as it is alienating to people who are autistic or do have ADHD or dyslexia or any other amount of differences in their neurological functioning. By using the term neurodiversity, we are talking about the idea that there isn't one right way to function a process, and that the differences in neurology are as common as differences in gender, sex, or race. Neurodiversity contains a whole spectrum of processing differences, and often you'll hear people talk about high or low functioning autism. Each individual will be different in how they process communications, but hopefully today I can give you some general tips that are broadly applicable to everybody. Some of the main communication challenges that people who live with autism can face are things like feeling like there's too much information or an information overload. Pragmatics, the appropriate use of language in social situations, such as being able to stay on topic and take turns in a conversation. Unspoken language, difficulty understanding social cues, body language, sarcasm, or figurative speech. ADHD is most commonly associated with hyperactivity, but it presents itself in lots of ways, including short attention spans, being easily distracted, and struggling to follow a thread or stay engaged. Like I said before, everybody is different and their accessibility needs will vary. But by attending this webinar, you've already taken the first step in accessible communications, which is just to be aware of the fact that communication should be accessible. So well done on showing an interest and being willing to learn, and I'm really excited for everything I'm about to show you. So, quick poll. How often at the moment do you feel like your organization considers accessibility in communications? Just publishing that poll there, so you should be able to vote in it. This is really interesting. There's a real range across the spectrum. Sometimes, rarely, nobody's voted never yet, which is great, but only 6% of people have said that their organization always considers accessibility. Interesting. Okay, so definitely lots of cool things. And I think, having an organizational buy-in can always be one of the most difficult parts of anything. So if there's, proof points behind it, which I'm going to share, then hopefully, we can move that all up to a sometimes or always for everybody. So what are some of the reasons that accessible design is important? Reaching a bigger external audience is key if you're looking to grow or expand your brand, especially if you're a company that relies on organic marketing or a nonprofit looking for donors. Making sure the most people possible understanding your marketing seems like a win. Lots of employers offer accommodations for employees with disabilities, but so often the focus is on visible disabilities. But how many employers make sure that people who are dyslexic or have visual impairments can thrive in the workplace? Many companies and countries will also have to comply with legal requirements around accessibility. These differ for each industry and location, so you'll have to look into them yourself, but it's definitely worth keeping in mind. As more people move to remote work, it's more important than ever to make sure your comms and materials are clear and understandable for your entire workforce. Previously, if an employee didn't understand, they could lean across to their desk mate, but since that's no longer an option, you need to make sure you're supporting all of your employees by making your comms accessible from the start. Working remotely is an alienating experience anyway, so try to avoid adding more difficulties on top of that for your staff. Okay, so let's get started with some accessible design top tips. And then after this, I'll dive into the medium-specific examples. So number 1, use a simple sans serif font in your design. So this is the difference between a serif and a sans serif font. Serifs are basically just the little fancy ledgers that go on the end of each letter. It's, quite a subtle thing, but it can make a lot of difference for people in terms of accessibility. Like taking a look at this example, it's really clear that font B is easier to read, especially when you get down to the smaller font sizes. As much as font A is a nice, decorative font, it's not really going to be the most accessible on your materials. In this example from HubSpot, who always have really good social media graphics, they've chosen a really simple, bold font. They've made sure that it's really easy to read at a glance, and they haven't overcomplicated it. And, I think this is something that most people can start to do in their social media images straight away. And this does bring us nicely onto the next one, which is using large font sizes. This infographic is a great example of using large fonts for clarity. Even though the rest of the text, which is what we call the body copy, is smaller, the headers are large, easy to read, and include enough information that you understand each section. Avoid patterned or complicated backgrounds. So this is the same chart but with different backgrounds. The patterned background with the gradient on the left looks cool, but it makes the text in the chart quite hard to read. Whereas the one on the right is much easier because the background has a good contrast and is simple. Speaking of which, use strong contrasting colours. Especially for people with colour blindness, it can be difficult to perceive colour contrasts. This red and green colour palette on the top line looks fine, but below is examples of how people with different types of colour blindness would perceive the chart. It's not great, and like I showed earlier in the sales chart example, it can be quite difficult when it's put into practice. Especially for people with colour blindness, contrasting colours are great. If you try and pick colours that are polar opposite on the colour wheel, like yellow and blue, you can really see the difference. We have an entire blog post filled with colour palette ideas for people with colour blindness, which I'll send out with the rest of the materials at the end. Another way that you can make your designs more accessible is showing differences with shades or patterns. Instead of relying solely on colour to show difference, use different shades or patterns. In the chart on the left, we can clearly see the different sections, even though they are all the same colour. And the chart on the right shows how patterns can differentiate the blocks as well as colour. Basically, anything you can do to make it more distinctive. Use icons wherever possible. Icons are also really important for your accessible designs. Icons can help provide context for text. Icons can be used to help illustrate a situation or an action, or give directions in a situation. Icons are also quickly understood at a glance. All of these icons are ones that I've just pulled from our icon library at Bengage, and I personally find them really handy for when I'm creating designs to be able to pick an icon quickly and make my design so much more accessible. Icons are especially helpful if you don't have access to good quality stock photography or any in-house images. Visuals, in whatever form they come, are always more compelling than text alone. Adding alt text to your images. Alt text is alternative text. This is the text that shows up when an image is unable to be viewed, either through technical faults or due to vision impairment. This example from the University of Leicester shows a bad and a good alt text. The more descriptive your text, the better. Alt text should be descriptive, specific, and accurate. Use consistent layouts. Both of these pages contain the same information, but the one on the left is so much easier to read. Consistent layouts help people with neurodiversity, especially autism and ADHD, and dyslexia understand the information better as they are able to follow the flow easier. Predictability in layouts is one of the quickest and easiest things you can do in terms of accessibility. And it just looks better as well. That one's always good. Add a double space in between words. This is more of a personal thing, but for some people, especially those with dyslexia, double spacing really helps out with avoiding the muddled word feeling. It doesn't make a lot of difference to your design, but it does help segment the words into separate chunks of text. This can make the reading experience so much easier. Avoiding large paragraphs of text. Honestly, our brains get tired all of the time, even if you don't have any processing difficulties. Breaking the text into smaller sections with paragraph headers where appropriate helps everybody understand your documents better. And don't worry if you didn't get all of those tips down. All of these tips are pulled from this handy accessible design checklist that you can download and keep as a reference whenever you're creating something new. So quickly, before we go into talking about accessible comms, I'd like to know, which do you create more of? Internal comms, external comms, or equal amounts? So I've just put a poll up there. So see, are people creating more internal documents? Are they creating more external documents? What is that you're looking to learn how to make accessible? Okay, so it seems like a fairly even split so far. Oh, I just said that, and then accessible channel shut up. Okay, cool. Okay, so people are either making more external comms or equal amounts, so that's really interesting. So, all of these tips are transferable, but the medium-specific one should hopefully really help you. So let's talk about accessible internal comms. Internal comms refers to any private communications that you send your workforce. This could be information about processes and department structures to newsletters about fundraising events. Being an inclusive employer means proactively making accessibility easier, not just waiting until somebody asks. Some of the main internal comms channels that you'll want to be thinking about are email, a chat function like Slack or Teams, a local intranet, or any form of internal message board, either digital or physical. There are obviously other communication touchpoints like desk dropping, old-fashioned post, or, where appropriate, phone calls. So first, let's talk about how to make newsletters accessible. Some of the key things you want to focus on in your newsletters is using standard fonts, something simple like Helvetica or Veranda. They're easy to understand and they're not too complicated. You can also use icons to illustrate your newsletter purpose or contents. Not only does this look better and more visually engaging, it also helps provide crucial context for, the information. You also want to add an alt text to your newsletters. I'll show you how to do this in a few slides' time. And making your timing predictable is really important as well. Unexpected emails can throw a lot of people, so make sure that you follow a regular schedule for sending out your communications. With newsletters, the number one thing that you want to avoid is sending out blocks of text like this. In this newsletter example, the fonts are simple and a good font size hierarchy where the most important information is in the largest text. Icons and good quality stock photography have also been used to help guide the content of the newsletter. And even if you don't have accessibility needs, this looks way better than that. Adding alt text is a really simple way to make your designs accessible. It'll differ based on which email platform you use, but there'll be detailed guides for each if you Google which platform you use, plus the words alt text. These screenshots are ones that I've just pulled from MailChimp, and it's really easy to add alt text when you upload an image. Your alt text should describe the images and include the copy. Alt text is important because people who use screen readers to verbalize text, such as people who live with visual impairments, need to be able to understand the materials you're sharing. So let's talk about accessible reports. A lot of the same rules from newsletters will apply throughout, such as standard fonts, icons, and alt text. But when it comes to reports specifically, you want to keep your design simple, use a consistent layout throughout the report, and add infographic exec summaries to the beginning of long reports so that people can understand the report contents at a glance. Exec summaries are handy for everybody, not just people who live with any of the conditions we've discussed. Simply put, an infographic exec summary is an overview of the key data contained in your report, presented in a one-page infographic. The idea being that execs don't have the time to read the whole report, so you have to summarize it for them. As you can see, these exec summaries include icons, simple charts, and very little text. This example is from an organization called Business in the Community, and I just pulled this one-page summary because I think it's a really good illustration of, getting the key information out top. Even if you don't have time to read the whole report, you can glance this page and understand what the main contents is. It's pretty easy to repurpose dense information in an infographic format once you've had a bit of practice. So I'm going to talk you through Vengage's 4-step formula for creating an infographic outline from existing content. Step number 1, determine the key takeaways of your content. I'm just going to be using this example, which is a diversity and inclusion infographic I wrote a while back. Just at the top, I've added a note about what the key information I want the reader to take away from this infographic is. Step number 2, determine the information. So thinking about what I want my readers to take away, I've gone through and highlighted the bits I want to include in the infographic. I know that I want the infographic to be super punchy, so I was super selective with which bits I highlighted. In this case, less is definitely more. Step 3. Consider the length of the paragraphs and the points. I deleted all of the extra text and rewrote the information into complete sentences, just to get an idea of the length. This is about right for what I'm picturing. And then step 4, add notes for the designer. At Venngage, we use Google Docs when working on infographic outlines, which makes it super easy to comment on specific parts of the text. Even if you're using a pre-made template and creating the information yourself, it'll be a good idea to note down any specific colors or icons that you're picturing in your head. Believe me, you will thank yourself later when you come around to designing. So then I sent this doc over to the wonderful design team and they created this beautiful infographic from it. As you can see, it's super informative, it only covers the main points, and it's really punchy, and all of my notes about icons have been taken on board. And it will come as no surprise that we have an infographic outlining how to make an infographic. So if you want to learn more about summarizing information, you can definitely check this out. But we also have an in-depth webinar about more detailed ways to summarize information that I'll send out a link to as well. So keeping all of that in mind, accessible presentations. When creating a presentation, the main things you want to keep in mind with accessibility are creating clean, easy to understand slides, like the ones that you're seeing today. It's also helpful to lay out an agenda and expectations up front. Lots of people like to know what to expect from any form of meeting or webinar, so it's handy to outline that straight away. Use simple fonts that can be read at a distance and send a summary or the slides post-meeting to give everybody a chance to understand. In this presentation example, we can see that there's an agenda up front and the slides are pretty simple and easy to understand, with only one key takeaway per slide. The colors are also pretty bold, which helps differentiate each topic. But don't just take it from me. This is a slide from Facebook's original pitch deck. They've kept the slides clean and simple and are using stats and graphs to speak for themselves. Nobody likes to read blocks of text on slides, and Facebook knew that. Alongside presentations, you might also be making a lot of process reports. To make sure your process reports are accessible, you need to ensure to show your process flows clearly, to make each step distinctive, to use a logical journey. The most common logical journey is either top to bottom or left to right in order to order your information. That's a tongue twister. So sure, you could just type out your process in a plain Word document, but is that going to be the most accessible course of answer? You know, this is quite a dense information. It's hard to follow the flow of. There must be a better way to do this, which, infographic. Putting your processes into an infographic format like this makes sure that the information flows and a lot of the distinct steps are as clear as possible through color coding, icons, and arrows. If you want to make a lot of process documents, you can even save your original design as a template and use the same layout again and again for ease, which is something I do a lot of when I'm creating documents on Venngage. And even just looking at this is way more easy to follow the flow of than this. So that's kind of all I had for internal comms. Obviously a lot of the external comms will also be relevant. So let's jump into external comms now. If you want to reach a bigger audience, you need to be understood. Your external comms are the things that the general public will see. Internally, you probably have a decent idea of your employee makeup and any accessibility requirements. But when it comes to external comms, you have no idea who might be looking for them. And reaching a bigger audience means more customers. So, if this is something you're doing for marketing purposes, making sure your external comms are really accessible is incredibly important. When it comes to external comms, the best way to be accessible is to build it into your brand. Think about the color palettes you use, any fonts you choose, what your logo looks like. You might also want to think about which platforms you choose to use. You might pick one newsletter service over another because the ability to add alt text is much easier, for example. Building accessibility in your brand also means that you don't have to worry about the basics when you create new content. At Venngage, we have a feature called Brand Kit where you're able to upload your fonts, logos, and color palettes and apply them automatically to designs, which really helps because I know that we already have a very accessible color palette and I don't need to spend time, thinking of new ones. Accessibility is something you should always be aware of, but it does make a big difference if you can put the work in up front. It saves so much time. One of the biggest external comms channels, especially at the moment, is social media. When you're making accessible social media images, you want to make sure you stick to the basic rules. Lots of icons, use a simple layout, and think about color contrasts. You also want to be on top of your adding alt text. This is something you can plan in advance when planning your social media strategy and content. Another way to make sure your social media assets more accessible is to create landing pages or LPs for further context. In these two social media examples, we can see the color contrasts, the simplicity, and the icons. Try to keep each social media graphic contained in that each individual image should only contain one key point or bit of information. When it comes to adding an LP, especially for any paid social ads you might run, the point is to add clarity or context. If you run an advert for a sunglasses sale, for example, make sure you include a link to the sunglasses sale LP, where you add full information about the promotion. This is common enough in paid digital anyway, but it's worth reminding yourself that accessibility is as important as selling and conversions. When it comes to making sure your socials are accessible, the Art Criticism website, The White Pew, but actually some of the best in the game. I realise this is quite a niche example, but hopefully you'll see why in a minute. So they release weekly reviews of art or culture, but they use text, and they also record themselves reading the blog post out loud and post that on their website too. This means that people who can't or don't have the time to read can also access the content. It's a really good way to repurpose information you already have to make it more accessible. All of the images that they share on social media also feature image descriptions shortened here to ID as well. This is something to help people with visual impairments, kind of a bit like alt text, to understand what is actually being shown in the image. Small things like this can go a long way in improving your accessibility and help people see that you're a progressive and accessible company. Again, I do get that this is a niche example, but when I was looking through other examples, a lot of companies aren't super consistent with their accessibility, so make of that what you will. Most social platforms allow you to add alt text. This is just a super quick example from Twitter. It sits under add description when you add an image into your tweet. And it's really handy, to just pop that in there when you're planning your content, when you're writing your marketing plan, so it's really easy to post. Another big external comms channel is print materials. When you issue any print materials, if possible, you should also try and issue electronic copies. This helps people with visual impairments who use screen readers. If there are any particular important points, such as a flyer about a sale, make sure you also email your mailing list details of the times and the places. Using icons and large fonts, especially on flyers, is key to making sure they're easy to understand. And always stick to contrasting color palettes. For this flyer to advertise a business, icons, large fonts, and a contrasting color palette have been used. It's super easy to understand and it contains a clear call to action to email for more information. If you want to add more information to your print materials, you can also consider adding a QR code to your flyers. When people scan a QR code on their mobile phone, a web page of your choosing will open on their device. A lot of companies are using QR codes, especially at the moment in the world of COVID, to provide digital menus or track and trace forms. So adding QR codes to print materials isn't going to take anybody by surprise anymore, and it's incredibly helpful. So just going to quickly recap some of the high-level accessible design, and then I can see that the chat is absolutely buzzing and I'd love to answer as many questions as possible. So use simple fonts. Make sure that your fonts are simple and sans serif if possible. Don't use embellishments or fancy designs, and make sure they are large enough to read from a distance. Using a good text hierarchy, where the most important information is the largest, is valuable as well. Big, clear font should be used for headers. Using icons and images is a great way to add context to your information or to illustrate instructions. Icons and images should be used wherever possible to illustrate or enhance what you're communicating. You probably noticed on these slides I actually used more icons than text, which really helped me explain some of the more difficult concepts around communication. Different symbols will have different meanings, but symbols and icons are practically universally understood, so make sure to use them. Adding alt text or a landing page for further clarification is especially important with digital materials. With things like Twitter's character limit and Facebook's no more than 20% of an image should be text rule, adding alt text and LPs is a really easy way to provide more information and context. When you're trying to communicate with people, you want to make sure they fully understand what you're saying. So it's absolutely best to err on the side of caution and make sure all of your bases are covered. Avoid large chunks of text in your designs. It's easier to lose focus and concentration when you're just looking at the large blocks of text. Creating shorter paragraphs and using headings can help you keep the focus on the information. Using icons and colors to help break up your text and provide context or anchor to the subject is another way that you can make your text more appealing. Obviously, there'll be some situations where long paragraphs are unavoidable, but wherever possible, try and break things into smaller, more manageable chunks. Pick your colors carefully when designing. Check to make sure your palettes are suitable for people who live with color blindness, and check there's enough of a contrast too. Consider using patterns or shades to help indicate difference rather than relying on color alone. Even when you're designing your brand and choosing a logo, think about how that logo will translate from full color to black and white. Will it still be easy to recognize and understand? And when it comes to colors, less is often more. Pick a few key colors to use throughout your designs and make sure your materials are legible. And finally, never be afraid to ask questions about accessibility. It's a difficult sentence as well. Never be afraid to ask questions about accessibility. If you're mostly creating internal comms, why not send out a survey asking people if they have any accessibility requirements, such as color blindness? It can be anonymous if it needs to, but it's good to be as open and honest with your employees as possible that you want to help them and give them the opportunity to ask for what they need. I've only really scratched the surface of accessible design here, but there's so many wonderful independent charities and organizations that have really good guides on accessibility for certain conditions that you can access as well. I'm going to try and send out as many resources as I can because, as I said, I think this is a really interesting topic and I think there's so much you can learn. But like I said earlier, the first step of making the world a more accessible place is being willing to learn how. So never be afraid to ask. So that's everything that I have planned, but I know there's lots of questions. Hopefully all of that information was useful to you, and I know there was a lot of it, so we will email the recording and the slides and a bunch of resources. And I just want to say a big thank you for everybody who joined today, because it's really exciting to see so many people care about accessible design as much as I do. So let me just have a scroll through. Yeah, definitely going to share, and we've got a lot of resources. I've seen a couple of people have been sharing Venngage links as well. We have a blog for almost everything at this point, so definitely have a dig in there if you have any specific questions. This question, how do I know which are the best colors to use? So the way that you pick colors is going to differ based on what the purpose is. If you're talking about picking colors for branding, you really need to do some thinking about your brand perception and your brand story. Do you want to paint your brand in a fun and friendly way and use sort of warm colors, or do you want to be more scientific and analytical and use cooler colors? If you're talking about picking colors for accessible design, a good rule of thumb is just to follow ones which are opposite on the color wheel and never really overcomplicate it. One thing that I like to do is pick one key color that's going to be the highlight color and then stick to black and white for the rest. Even on these slides, we had a blue background and we had black text on a white box. But occasionally there'd be a green bubble that would pop up, and that would kind of draw your attention to that information. So it's kind of depends on the context of how you want to pick colors. But there are color palettes that we have vetted that are suitable for people who do live with color blindness. So we have already done some of that work. Let's see, any other questions? Which tip would be best to implement as a starting point? So again, like I said, accessibility is a spectrum, and there's so many different ways that you can implement it. As a starting point, rather than implementing one tip, I try and update one lot of materials. So if you make a lot of process reports, like the example, rather than trying to make, your process reports and your presentations and your social media graphics accessible at the same time, just start by building a really solid process report graphic that you can reuse, that it has, big headers, it's got contrasting colors, it uses patterns, it uses icons. And then you can slowly work to incorporate that into all of your process flows that you're creating. And once you've got that sorted, you can then move on to presentations or social media graphics. Accessible design is such a big area, and it's quite different from a lot of the designs that you'll be creating at the moment. So it would probably be a bit overwhelming to implement all of the information I've just given you at the same time. But maybe just starting on one lot of material would be really good. What's the best way to pick an icon? So picking an icon, it really depends on what you're hoping to achieve. You can pick an icon based on how it looks or the colors. There's a really good website called Noun Project. I'm not sure if people have heard of that, where it's a bunch of vector icons that have been collected by keyword. So if you need to illustrate something, say accessibility, you can type the keyword accessibility into Noun Project, and it'll throw out a bunch of different interpretations of what accessibility looks like in icon format. Then after that, what I usually do is I go back to Venngage with the icon in my mind, and I search for that, and I pick something that matches my color palette and also matches the intended audience of what I'm creating. And so all of the icons I used in this were quite grown up, for a lack of a better way to put it. They weren't cartoonish, they weren't really childish, but they were very informative. So I went into it looking for icons of people and icons of situations that felt like they were at home in a presentation for this audience. It's a really interesting topic, and I saw that somebody shared that we have a symbols and meaning blog post where we did some incredible research about, what different symbols mean, how you can use them, what some good examples are. So definitely check that out if you have a chance. Other questions? Yep, I will definitely post the link to the accessible icons. Do I have a go-to font to help the greatest number of those with dyslexia? So this is quite an interesting topic at the moment. For a long time, people said that Comic Sans was actually the most interesting and most accessible font for people with dyslexia. But Comic Sans is actually not good for everybody with dyslexia. A lot of people with dyslexia appreciate Comic Sans because it most mimics handwriting and they find it easier for their eyes to process when it's on the screen. But for a lot of people, the font is a bit too wiggly. It's a weird word, but it's a bit too wiggly. They want something a bit more rigid to help them understand. If it's somebody in particular, definitely, ask them, do you like Comic Sans, or would you prefer something like Veranda? Would you prefer something like Helvetica, where the letters are a lot more rigid? If that's not an option, I definitely suggest trying both out. If it's something like a social media post, you can try both fonts and see which one gets the best results, see which one gets the best engagement. Your engagement from your posts will be a good indicator that people are understanding them. So it can be interesting to A/B test in that way if it's something that's more public facing. Let's see. So many questions. You guys have been wild on the chat. In PowerPoint, is it good to change graphics in each slide or stay with the conventional process? Both is the answer to that. I'd say stay with a consistent layout, but change the graphics and, the information. Another thing that you can do in PowerPoint especially is you can symbolize headings by using a different font layout or a different color. I don't know if you noticed, but through this PowerPoint, when I wanted to talk about something new, the text in the slide would be blue instead of black. So that's a really subtle way to show that this is new information, this is something new that we are talking about, but it used the same general layout throughout. It's kind of that predictability thing that I went back to. It's good for people to expect what they're expecting. And if you change things up too much, it can be quite distracting and they can't really focus on the information as such. How can you get buy-in on accessibility from senior staff when there's not a lot of time or budget? Great question. Especially in the world of education and nonprofits, there's a lot of difficulty in terms of budget and time restrictions. It can be hard to try and implement something new if you don't have proof it's going to work. Especially at the moment, so many companies are working on skeleton staff or making redundancies that it can feel like there's so much work to go around that it can be hard to introduce something new like accessibility. I think in terms of getting buy-in from senior staff, proving it works is one of the best things you can do. Like I mentioned earlier with A/B testing social media images, if you're an internal organization, why don't you just send out a survey to people through, your HR or your human resources or your diversity and inclusion teams, asking if people feel like they understand the materials, feel like they can access the materials. And if the majority of people say they're fine, you might get one or two people say they're fine, but I wish it would come at the same time, or I wish there was alt text included, or I find this color palette a little bit difficult. So that can be a conversation you have with employees and then take that to senior staff. If it's something external, you can approach it from a branding point of view. Being a progressive company and having top quality accessible communications is such a good thing to get into now. When I was researching this webinar, I saw accessible design on so many marketing trend prediction lists. But I don't think accessible design should be a trend. It should just be commonplace. But if you do it well now and you do it quickly and you get known within your own community as somebody who is an organization that values accessibility, then that's going to do so much for customer loyalty. It's really going to help build your brand up as well. So it might just be a case of reframing how you're talking about accessible designs and why you want them. I mean, obviously you can say, everything should be accessible, but I know you need the proof point. So branding is another way that you can get that in. Where do you find the alt text in Word? I'm not 100% sure on Word, but if you Google the program name plus alt text, there's pretty much detailed guides for everything. When I was going through Twitter and MailChimp and stuff, I found loads of step-by-step broken down guides on how to add and access alt text. See if there's any other questions. Do you find that the thickness of body text fonts has negative impact on readability? So yes, I think that how thick your body text is definitely affects the readability. It's kind of like if everything's important and everything's bold, then nothing's important and nothing's bold. If possible, you should try and stick to a thinner body text than the heading, but you can still use bold to highlight key phrases or key stats. You don't want it to look like it's just a paragraph of shouting, though. That's not going to do anybody any good. So definitely try and keep it a thinner body text, something like a regular or a thin, as opposed to a bold or an extra bold in your body. Wow, so many links. This is great. We don't have a HR team, and our marketing and events manager handles all of our external comms. Yeah, so it can be more difficult as well when you are a small organization. Definitely in some charities that I've worked with where there's been 4 of us, it's been really hard to find the time to dedicate to accessible comms. So I'm hoping that a couple of the tips and tricks I showed you are things that you can build into your workflow and your processes. Things like writing the alt text for your social media images when you're writing the social media copy. That saves so much time, and then it's a copy and paste job. And once you get into the process, it's actually quite easy. But it is something that you do have to constantly remind yourself to do, which is why I'm going to send out the accessible design checklist as well, so you can just go through and tick things off. Any other questions? Somebody's asking about kerning. Cool. So just for reference for people who don't know, kerning is the amount of space in between letters. So kerning is like, do you have a letter and then a lot of space and then another letter, or are they quite compact and jammed together? So Venngage doesn't actually currently offer kerning. I can check with design to see if that's something that they have on the list, because we have paragraph spaces and line breaks. So I can definitely take that up. But as a cheat, you can just put an extra space in between letters. It takes much longer, but it does help, especially for titles. If you're trying to segment chunks, you can just add an extra space and then it bam, bam, bam. Any other questions? Yep, LP is landing page. Sometimes you're so far in the marketing world that you forget that, not everybody says LPs on a regular basis, but the Venngage team, that's how we talk to each other. Maybe I should do a glossary of some of these words. That's a fun idea. Yeah, so these options are things that I've illustrated how you do them in Venngage, just because, that's the tool I use to create presentations. But these are things you can do in PowerPoint, you can do them in Keynote, you can do them in InDesign if you're one of those people. It's super easy to take the base level of these tips. Even things like the icons, you can find icons on Venngage, download them, and then put them into a different document if that's something you're looking for. I've tried to keep the information as actionable as possible, because I really want people to be able to do something that's positive with all of this. So do you have a blog or LinkedIn profile? You can find me on the internet. I'm Alice Corner at Blurg, but we also have the Venngage blog, and as I said, we've got detailed guides on so many questions. I think I've got time for a couple more. Any top tips on alt text? Yeah, so alt text is an interesting one to try and write, because you have to put yourself in the position of somebody who can't load the image, especially if you're sharing something like a social media copy or an embedded image in a newsletter. You should try and include all of the copy, all of the text from the image in the alt text, because if it doesn't load, you still want people to know the information. But also in general, you should try and give a description of what the image looks like. So instead of just saying, girl in laboratory, you should say, there's a graduate student, she's in the laboratory, she's working with a test tube, it's a close-up, there's a speech bubble that says this. Try and describe it as if you were playing almost reverse Pictionary, and you can't draw any pictures, but you have to get somebody to draw the picture. Yeah, that makes sense. So try and be as descriptive as possible, but also think, what is the important information that you can take away from this? Like, if the important information is that you have a sunglasses sale, make sure you put that in the alt text very early on, so people know what it is that they're reading the image description of. Any other last questions? Can you share Venngage presentations if the recipient doesn't have the package? Yes, you can. So with Venngage, you can send them either a sharing link, you can send them a link that they can comment on if they have a Venngage account, or if you have a Venngage Premium or Business account, you can download it as either PDF, PowerPoint, or PNG. So there's lots of ways to share. Cool, I think that's all of the questions. I'm just scrolling. Why is routine and consistency important in design? Is it just for people with autism and still new to accessibility? Yeah, so routine and consistency is an interesting thing to think about in terms of accessible design, because people understand patterns, and our brains naturally look for patterns in almost anything, in design, in text, in life events. It's when sometimes you see a cloud and you're like, that cloud looks like a duck. The cloud doesn't look like a duck. Your brain is just recognizing the pattern of the shape of a duck and is applying it to the cloud. So patterns are really important to people. For people who live with things like autism, patterns can be especially important because they don't have a lot of the same strategies for processing subtleties of information like figurative speech or sarcasm as people who don't have autism have. So patterns can be a good way for them to make sense of what appears to them to be quite a muddled world. So, when it comes to predictability, send your newsletter at the same time every week. So the person with autism knows that on Friday mornings we get the newsletter about what's happening next week. And it really helps them build a pattern of expectation in their head, and it makes it not too confusing or jarring, and it really helps set a routine of expectations. I hope I explained that okay. It's quite an interesting topic to get into. Best font to use when you also have to download a PDF or PNG. Yeah, so again, it depends on what the purpose of your download is. If you are downloading to make a big poster, then you can use a big font, something like Impact or something like a bold Helvetica that people will see from a distance. If you're downloading as a PDF to send a report or to send a newsletter, you can maybe use something that's slightly more complicated, like a simple serif, something like Times New Roman. I try and avoid anything decorative or anything handwritten or fancy, and try and stick to as simple as possible. But when you're creating your documents, think about what their intended use is as well. Like I said, if it's a poster you're going to see from far away, make sure the font is super simple and clean and easy to understand from far away. So the simpler, the better. Is that all of the questions? Yeah, I think so. If you have any more questions, feel free to drop me a line as well. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to talk about accessible design all day, but I know that you wonderful people are all very busy, so I will stop myself now. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope this was useful. I'm so excited to see what designs you're making accessible. I think this is great. And thank you so much for joining us, everybody. I hope you have the wonderful rest of your day.